Hello, everybody. This is Alex Howard coming to you from Washington, D.C. I'm so excited to be part of Forward 50 again. I wish I could be there in person in Ottawa with all of you, but we're all making this work, right? We're all finding new ways to connect and reconnect in virtual contexts. And it's very exciting to be with you here to have a really interesting conversation about distributed collaboration. If you've arrived here on this, then you're hopefully coming in for a session about building and understanding and learning networks. We're going to be talking about United Nations Development Programs Accelerator Labs Network, and I'm really excited to hear more about what they're doing, how they're doing it. And if you haven't heard about it, it's a decentralized learning network. There's more than 90 different innovation labs to serve 114 different countries. We've got two people who have been central to setting this up and working on it, building on it, extending it. So I'm really excited to get to them next, to give them the full stage to talk with you. I want to just quickly remind everyone that we are adhering to a code of conduct, which you can find at forward50.com/code-of-conduct. It's the bottom of that page. So please respect each other, come here with the ability to listen and engage. And with that, I really want to get to the actual program itself. So Gina Lucarelli and Jeremy Boy are going to talk about how they set up the UNDP's Accelerator Labs Network. And they're going to talk about how they listen for the emergence of learnings. And we're going to hear from both of them in a couple of presentations. I'm very excited to hear from them. I imagine you are too. And shall we be off to the races here? Have you decided who's going to go first here?
That's me. Yeah.
Great. Awesome. Well, the stage is yours.
Thank you so much. So you guys can see my slides, or maybe you need to pull them. There we go. Cool. Well, thank you guys so much. This is great to have a chance to talk to you, and great to talk to people who already start with the frame of distributed collaboration. That's always a good start. My name is Gina Lucarelli. I'm the team leader. We'll hear in a moment from Jeremy Boy, our lead data scientist. And essentially, we wanted to talk to you about kind of the early tales of our experience setting up what we call a learning network. So just a little bit on kind of why we did this. Essentially, we're working at the United Nations. Our mandate is to help governments and partners advance sustainable development. And we see it as a complex problem. So if you imagine you're sort of, in this street, this is a good example of a complex problem, right? People are moving, cars are moving, there's different sounds. You're not going to sit in your hotel room, a year in advance and make a plan how to cross the street with 5-year-old data. You're going to be adapting in the moment. And if you kind of multiply this by many levels of magnitude, that's kind of what it takes to get almost 8 billion people on the planet to live and farm and grow their food and move around in the world and charge their phones and carry their groceries home from the market in a way that's more sustainable. So we imagine that this is very much a distributed problem. It is not a problem that's going to respond to top-down policies or dictates. I apologize for this hideous looking slide, but it's hideous for a reason. We work together with governments on the Sustainable Development Goals, which are a set of 17 really ambitious targets for 2030. And honestly, even before COVID-19, the pandemic hit and its economic aftermath started to be felt, we knew that we needed to tap into collective intelligence. So people's wisdom and perceptions and ideas and all of those micro decisions they make into a day in order to achieve the goals. Now, in the wake of the pandemic, the data is not yet in, but the general consensus is, I think Bill and Melinda Gates put it well. They said we've lost 25 years and 25 weeks. We expect huge problems in health and education disruptions, service disruptions, even 100% increase in malaria deaths in Africa. Even the Great Pause didn't really reduce carbon emissions enough to get us on to reduce global warming to the point where we can stay within 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is kind of the safe zone. So So here we are, and we kind of now more than ever really need to tap into distributed intelligence in order to make this happen for the world. So we set up a lot of labs. We built a lot of labs in the last year plus, and these labs are spread around the world. Just to give you a sense, these are the countries. We've got quite a few in Africa, something like 35 in Africa. We're covering 70% of small island development states. We're working in places like Syria and Iraq and other fragile situations. So we're really trying to test this hypothesis that public sector innovation labs can work under a wide range of contexts. And we do this within the United Nations Development Program, which is a 17,000 person, 5 billion a year annual budget organization that works in 170 countries. And it's very much a public sector organization that has a lot of infrastructure set up to ensure accountability for results and delivery of activities, based on the fact that we're using taxpayer money. So we're trying to bring in this agile social innovation capability into a large public sector organization. Somewhere over the summer, Elizabeth Altman and Frank Nagel put out this article in the MIT Sloan Review, where they looked at our work. And I really like their framing, because they said what we're doing here is building a network of ecosystems to tap into distributed intelligence, which is way better than we could have ever framed it ourselves. And it's extremely ambitious, because what it means essentially is that not only are we trying to steward and curate a network of 92 labs around the world, those labs are embedded in their own innovation ecosystems, where they're working with startups and research and development units inside water ministries and municipalities and many, many other actors. So we're operating on, like, distributed times 1,000. And so when we kind of think of, like, what does it really take to steward this network of ecosystems? What does that mean? How do we even see what the network is doing? How do we learn from it? How do we then, hopefully, because we're ambitious and because we see the demand in the outside world for some advancements in sustainable development, how do we advance the state of what we know to expand the edges of knowledge? So just to give you a bit of an example here, it's, each lab determines what they work on, and to a large extent how they work as well. At some point last year, we noticed we had a lot of labs, like over 30, working on the issue of waste management. And, first, that was a finding in itself. Why is that an important issue? Why is the UN Development Program tackling that? Why do they feel they need innovation labs to do it? That's all one level of questioning. But when we took a step back, we realized that we were starting to spot a pattern, that actually it was the informal waste pickers and people with lower incomes who were more likely to sort their waste and more likely to create value from garbage. So we started to have this kind of slow hunch developing that, this is a picture from Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe is a place where 90% of the economy is informal economy. So we started to really think, wait a minute, maybe this informality is a feature, not a bug. And maybe, just maybe, that informal sector is making a contribution to the circular economy that we're not seeing. So in order to kind of test out a hypothesis like this, we feel we need to kind of readjust the way we manage information, the way we manage knowledge, if one can manage knowledge. And so we started to think, actually, that knowledge management really needs to be reinvented, right? I think many of us are well aware of the information overload problem, but there are other problems that we've seen related to, so if you have an existing taxonomy, so let's say we would say to all the labs, tell us which sustainable development goal you're working on, and what you're doing, which we did. We'd made this mistake and we continue to do it. we would have missed the whole pattern that was emerging on the informal economy and the value of the informal sector for the circular economy. We would have totally missed that if we had been only hyper focused on there are 17 goals and that's the track. And does it fall within this existing taxonomy that we see in front of us? And finally, I've put this kind of provocatively here just to say, one man's lesson is another woman's no shit Sherlock. Just to say that learning is so contextual, right? Often, a huge epiphany for me can be completely obvious to you. Even this question about the link between the informal economy and the circular economy, I'm always asking myself, does everybody know that? Or is this a breakthrough? So we're trying to kind of work around the limits of current knowledge management and to create new ways of allowing for emergence. So essentially, we're doing a few kind of concrete things that I just wanted to share and put out there and get some feedback on. First, we don't ask the labs to write activity reports. What we ask them to do is work out loud, and we kind of default to public, as it were, and say every month, publish a blog on the United Nations website about what you're doing and what you're learning, and how things are going and where things are going to go in the future. And then we take that text and we try and mine for the patterns within it. We also try, and this is a constant struggle for us, to go where the conversation is. So in our organization, Microsoft is the main corporate software. We set up a Microsoft Teams set of networks, but we found that all of the action, all of the rich conversations were on these WhatsApp channels that Jeremy will give you a glimpse under the hood on in a moment. And we realized, look, maybe we should be looking over there rather than in the structures that we set up for knowledge management and exchange. And we do try and kind of let the taxonomy emerge from this really, really messy space where every lab can work on what they want to work on, and it changes all the time, and we have no idea what they're going to be learning. So we're trying to sort of let it be messy and then find the patterns within it. And of course, we're thinking about like a million things. We're trying to figure out how to steward this network, how to manage this network, if one can manage a network. We're trying to figure out, what the labs are even doing in the first place. Then we're also trying to figure out, how do we land the innovation methods and tools that they're using back in the core business? And of course, we're always pushed to prove our legitimacy, to founding investors, et cetera. But we're trying to kind of keep our eyes peeled on these 4 areas. One is kind of, how do you actually do a certain kind of innovation in a certain context? So how do you use mobile money transactions in Zimbabwe to understand resilience of the economy during a lockdown, right? How do you actually do that? We also look for, we have a lot of ethnographers in our lab network, and they help us look for kind of the practices, the coping mechanisms, the innovations that women and men who are dealing with climate change or trying to social distance in complex situations and very tight situations. We try and learn from them as a signal of needs that are not being met by the government, and needs that are not being met by any of our projects, and needs that are not being met by the market at an affordable rate. We're also constantly looking for weak signals of sustainable development. What does it mean, for informal waste pickers when the market shuts down? What's happening to supply chains? Is panic buying affecting the availability of essential supplies in a given context? And then, of course, we're trying to keep track of the results of our experiments, because that's the whole ballgame. So we've kind of put together this workflow, which again is really a work in progress, and we really would like feedback on this. So if this is chartered territory and you can save us a step, please do. So essentially, the labs reflect in free text form. We're dealing mainly with text right now. We go to Jeremy to orchestrate the machines to help us find kind of signposts for where to look and where to dig deeper. We have humans on the team who kind of read these reflections and blogs and murals for patterns. Then we sort of create these pattern summary, for example, around the informal economy and the circular economy. And then in order to kind of verify those slow hunches, we need research partners. We need people who are well grounded in that field, who then bring their expertise together with our kind of on the ground, from the trenches knowledge. So, for example, we're working with MIT on informal innovation. We're looking at working with other partners on informal transportation. We're trying to really understand the space of informality. So this is kind of just the overview of what we're doing and why. I'll hand over now to Jeremy, who'll give you a sense of what this looks like under the hood.
Thank you, Gina. So I will continue, I guess, where Gina left off, and give you a bit of a deep dive into indeed how we're trying to follow the conversation where it is. So I'm assuming you can all see my slides. And I want to start, Gina kind of mentioned this, but with the concept of really decentralization. This is really where the complexity comes in for us. A small global team, essentially distributed between New York and Istanbul, to keep track of 60 here on the map, but now 92 different labs in different countries. Each of these labs is embedded in a UNDP country office, so there's decentralization also in the way they report to different entities within UNDP. They interact with government, they interact with private sector, all of this locally. So again, highly decentralized network and highly decentralized operations. Gina also mentioned that the labs determine what they work on. Here's a rough overview of the different areas that the different labs are working. So solid waste management and responsive governance are big ones, but we have quite a wide variety across the network. And so our role in the global lab and the global team is to try and keep track of all this, make sense of it, try to establish the connections where they're relevant. And so one thing that really unites this network is the different communications channels that they use. So Gina was mentioning a very sort of bottom-up thing that appeared in the network is the use of WhatsApp across the different labs and across the different roles in the different labs. And so the question for us, or the starting point here really is, can we use this passively generated data to understand, support, and learn from the network, learn these, or at least get the entry points into these different topics that Gina just mentioned, that the different labs are working on. So Backtrack about 1.5 years ago, at the very beginning of all of this, when people were still allowed to travel, a series of boot camps were organized to onboard all the new recruits. And indeed, during the boot camps, kind of organically, all the different heads, so in each lab we have 3 different heads of solutions mapping, a head of exploration, and a head of experimentation, decided to create their own WhatsApp groups to exchange different methodological threads, or to exchange on the different frontier challenges that they were working on, and so on. And so what's really interesting about these WhatsApp groups and channels is they're, again, emergent from the practices of the individuals that constitute the network. It's not something that's imposed top-down by whether the corporate Microsoft agreement or whatever tool the global team decides. And so they're actually quite active on a regular basis. So some spikes, some days go up to 250 messages. On average, it's about 40 to 50 messages a day, which might not seem like a lot. You might think I have about the same amount of emails in my inbox. This is on top of the emails in the inbox. So for keeping track of this manually, I mean, obviously it's quite challenging. Knowing also that we have 3 main channels. So again, we have 3 heads per lab. Each head has their own channel. We also have mirror channels for the main ones in English that are in French, because a good part of our labs in Western Africa are Francophone. We also have some in Spanish. The point here is that it's across a whole number of languages, across a whole number of different channels. It's a lot of content to mine and to keep track of. And so typically the things that come up on these channels are information like situational awareness of where the labs are or what might be happening to the country in which we have a lab. So here on the left, we have a message from our colleagues in the Philippines saying that a typhoon is about to hit them. This is shared across all the network. Another one in the middle here, coming, I believe, from our colleagues in Uganda, is asking questions about how to interact with the UNDP country office, how to help them in the process of establishing essentially their 5-year plan for the future. The last one I have here on the right is exchanging different resources, different tools, online tools. So again, these are very anecdotal examples, but they give you a sort of sense of the extent or the diversity, let's say, of information that we can get access to by mining this information. And so actually, through all of these exchanges that just organically happen, we are sitting on top of a treasure trove, really, of information that we need to somehow, mine. And so the three main things that we're interested in is seeing the network, so understanding if the network exists, is active, learning from the network. So the informal economy example that Gina was mentioning, the solid waste management examples. We're trying to pick up these signals of different, like similar topics that emerge from different countries within different labs. And then the last part is trying to amplify what the network is doing. And so our question is, how can we use these instant messages to characterize the network? So I'm going to give you a very brief technical deep dive here, just to give you a sense of what the material we're working with is. So any instant messaging has mainly two pieces of metadata: a phone number, which is great, it gives us a location. And so if we look at all of the exchanges in a given WhatsApp group, we have a sense of who's interacting and how much. So here, this is very, very basic. One thing that we see immediately is, at least for us, because we know where we have labs, Chad and Ghana are not present on this channel. So this might be something where we want to, as the global team, encourage them to plug in and exchange with the rest of the network, because they might be missing out on interesting information that is shared by the others. But again, this is extremely basic. The other piece of information is essentially the timing of the messages. And so if we look through, look how the messaging happens, how people interact on these threads, essentially we see that there are surges. So there might be long periods of inactivity and then very rapid surges of exchanges. And essentially these surges map to specific conversations. So someone will ask a question, others might respond, add to the question, and so on. And so this is really useful because we can break down essentially all of the threads into individual conversations around given topics, around given themes. And so with some very basic signal processing here, we can extract something like this, which is a conversation from one of our, I think it's the Explorers channel. And accessing these conversations for understanding what the labs are talking about is really important. So say here we're interested in looking at what the labs are saying or exchanging around do-it-yourself solutions for addressing COVID. If I was to look for DIY or do-it-yourself in all the individual messages, I might find this message here saying this is great. So another DIY video on making sanitizer by a startup here in India. But I wouldn't follow up with the link. So I would miss actually the content of interest, and I wouldn't get all the context around the conversation. Here, a message from Sudan adding to the message from our lab in India. So now that we can break down the conversations, each of the groups into, or the threads of each of the groups into individual conversations, we can actually get a much more granular picture of how the network is alive. We can start to really see the network, see who's interacting with whom. So who happens to be in conversations together more often or not. So typically here we see that Turkey and Azerbaijan on the Explorers channel interact a lot together. And so this is really relevant for us in the global team, once again, because in our role of trying to plug in the different parts of the network that might not be connected enough or might not be communicating, while we know that they are working on similar topics, and this is something that I end up having to do quite a bit. This can be really, really useful. Again, knowing that maybe country A is working on solid waste management, country B is also, but seeing that they don't communicate a lot on these channels or interact a lot, gives us the possibility to go in and encourage them to see what the others are doing. And this becomes even more interesting if we can then zoom in on specific topics within conversations. So here we have air pollution, sanitizers, solid waste management. And by pulling up the conversations that relate to each of these individual topics, we can see who the actors, who the labs across the network are, who are talking about this and how they interact together. So again, from the global team's perspective, this gives us the opportunity to go and plug in or connect the labs that maybe should be connected. Another thing that having these conversations approach enables is to model each of the blocks, each of the conversations themselves. So this way we can start to really learn from the network. It's one thing, as I was showing before, to go in with a bunch of keywords and look for things that we might have in mind. But as Gina was mentioning, the whole purpose here is to be much more emergent. And so with these conversations, we can start to model the different topics that the labs are talking about. And so here I've pulled three just for examples. One around intellectual property, another one again around sanitizers, and a third one around waste pickers and the informal economy, actually around waste picking. A last thing, maybe a bit more exploratory, that we are trying out is kind of moving beyond what is directly exchanged within the channels, the communication channels of the different labs. So here, this was an exercise we did at the very beginning of the pandemic. The labs obviously started talking about how the pandemic was affecting their countries. They were sharing different bits of news, different solutions that they were observing in the different countries in which they are. And so using all of the links that they were sharing as an initial resource and then crawling out from those links, so each link points to a page, we use that page and look for all the links and use all those links to go to the other pages. We were able to go from roughly 100 different links that we found in our WhatsApp conversations to about 5,000 links related to COVID very, very early on in the crisis. And this is interesting because it surfaces things like the MIT Emergency Ventilator Project, which is, I guess, maybe a usual suspect, something that many people may have seen. But it also then points to much more local, much more maybe under the radar things like this startup in Chile that was very, very prompt, very quick to respond and start in creating PPE, so personal protection equipment. So to wrap it up, I guess just a couple of thoughts on the approach here and more broadly our approach to knowledge management from within the global team of the Accelerator Lab Network. This that I showed you is but a single tool platform in a suite that fits into the broader picture that Gina was showing earlier. And really the philosophy behind this is that we don't expect this kind of automation to completely replace, indeed, the human eye reading through the content, and more importantly, acting on the content. What we are trying to do here is really, again, understanding where the conversation is. Essentially, it's looking for where to look. And then when we know where to look, we might know how to act or where to act. And so again, these are but entry points to understand, support, and learn from the network. And then the last thought that I would like to share, this is actually one of the Accelerator Lab principles. So beyond just this more internally focused work, it's something that all the labs apply in their own work: data empowerment, not extraction. And I think what we're trying to do, what we're trying to set up with all of these tools, is not just something from the global perspective to understand what all of the labs are doing. It's also re-injecting all of that knowledge directly into the lab. So we can intervene from the global perspective, but it's also potentially a tool for self-adjustment of the network from within. So this tool based on the WhatsApp conversations, but all the different tools that we're building really serve to reveal the network to itself. And with that, I guess we have some time for questions. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much. We'll see if Gina comes. There she is. Come join as well. So we had a quick back and forth at the beginning of your talk, where someone pointed out that I had said decentralized, riffing off of the session description. But of course, these labs are distributed, and it brings an interesting question. If you're being a good steward of networks, as Gina described, what does that mean for your management of them? How do you maximally empower people, but make sure they're adopting the right platform or standards or method of capturing knowledge or insight?
Well, I guess the first idea is just don't try to manage it. I mean, it's a network, don't try to manage it. But and so that's where, you know, steward is a lovely word, and curate is a lovely word, because it really kind of puts you in a more humble space, that, you know, a lot of your time is just catching up with the network and knowing what it's doing. We do, I mean, we touch base every week. You know, we do scrum calls every 7 a.m. New York time, Tuesday morning. That's where we are. And we check in all of those moments. But there are moments when we start to see, like Jeremy was talking about, intellectual property, right? So let's see, there's a focus on intellectual property, and people naturally, the heads of solutions mapping, whose job it is to find grassroots innovations that the United Nations doesn't know about, they get worried about intellectual property. How do we protect this when it might not already be protected? It may be community knowledge. There's a whole minefield in there. So we kind of pick up on those weak signals, and we basically take it to senior management of the organization, and we say, listen, the United Nations setup on intellectual property doesn't seem to fit with what we're doing. We think there may need to be an evolution there, maybe towards open source, towards a licensing system, we may need to help these people protect their ideas. And so we kind of surface it up that way. And the surfacing is really more to remove bottlenecks for them than to control what they're doing. I don't know, Jeremy, what you think.
No, I agree. I think maybe one of the often go-to points is acceleration in the Accelerator Labs is not acceleration as in startup universe with incubation acceleration and so on. It's not about identifying the single solutions that we then scale to solve all the problems in the world. It's really accelerating the learning process of the organization that is UNDP. And so typically picking up these signals really does, and as Gina was mentioning, bringing this up to senior management, does accelerate, you know, identifying where the pain points are. It's essentially what is blocking an organization like UNDP from delivering on different aspects. And so, again, by trying to identify these different things, and again, the labs and the works that they're doing directly, it's really about accelerating the learning around thematic challenges, and also about institutional bottlenecks.
So speaking of challenges and bottlenecks, we'll get one question in before we end. Someone brings up a great question. This is Annette Hester. It says, you started so many labs in such a compressed timeline. And what are your biggest takeaways? What failed? What wouldn't you do this way again? If you had someone looking at what you did and how you did it, what would you change?
Well, we do have someone looking at what we did and how we did it, because we're now being audited. So it's a very apt question, Annette. I think what we're seeing is there's a little bit of we stood this network up really quickly, right? I mean,
Mhm.
for the United Nations to recruit, about 200 people in these different contexts for jobs which we never recruited for before, in about 6 months and to onboard them in that time was sort of like lightning speed for
Mm.
us. So in the kind of moving quickly, things were really, they were messy, in the sense that bringing on board new team members now is really tough because we all have this kind of, those who are kind of the original gangsters have this sort of, understanding of why we do what we do, but we basically can't explain it.
Hmm.
So I guess, I mean, maybe it's a cue from David Snowden, who always says in a crisis, you should have one like learning and innovation team who's just documenting what's going on and what's being learned,
Mhm.
because when you're moving fast like that, you're learning at an incredible pace, but you're not sitting down to write it down or journal or work out loud as much as you should.
Right.
And it's a shame because you're just learning at lightning speed.
Well, that's a great point. Of course, this has now come to an end because I'd love to expand on this. The need for people working in distributed places across time zones and countries to narrate their work, right? To make it possible to go back and find things. It's a different paradigm we're all living through. We're in the stream, and sharing what we learn as we learn it has upsides and downsides. And thank you so much for sharing your insights into what's working for you. I hope you keep doing more of that, and that you continue to engage with the people in this learning platform we've created here for this conference, so that you can create more connections and hopefully bring them back to your organization. It's wonderful. Thank you so much for your time today. And thank you to all the guests who showed up, the wonderful questions in the back channel. I always love when the people formerly known as the audience become part of these conversations and make them so much better. There's going to be a break in this channel. We had the next guest cancel, but there'll be, I think, a new one at 3 o'clock Eastern Time. And really looking forward to continuing these conversations. And we'll see you all online.